So, just what did the Europeans do to bring about their own demise? Well, simply put, it's their insane immigration policies. Let's head over to the swamp and I'll explain. I think you'll agree. Hey everybody, how's it going? Welcome back to the swamp. So yeah, Europe, like America was before we elected Trump, is in the midst of its most dire dilemma that it's ever been in. You know, worse than both world wars that they started, and in both cases needed us to end them. You know, what makes this worse is that they brought it on to themselves with all their white man bad, self-hatred, and white guilt that they've all been indoctrinated into by these woke liberal elitists that have been running the EU for the past 30 years or more. You know, they either don't see what's happening or more than likely they pretend it isn't happening. You know, and they turn a blind eye towards everything. You know, I actually think it's impossible for these narcissists to ever admit to being wrong, especially when you've been wrong for the last 30 years. So if we're doing the exact same thing over here for the exact same reason, you know, desperately trying to replace the majority white population, which these messed up lefties despise, even though they're part of it. You know, anyways, their goal is to replace white people with non-whites. You know, it doesn't matter what color they are, as long as they're not white. Now, here's the big difference between what we did here in America and what the Europeans did over there, and why they'll probably never recover from it. You know, they are absolutely doomed. Well, if you notice, the vast majority of non-white immigrants being brought to America are Hispanic, you know, mostly coming from either Mexico, Central America, or South America. And the main thing they all have in common with each other and with us is that we're all Christians. You know, that makes it so much easier for them to assimilate into our society. Whereas the Europeans brought in a vast majority of Muslims. Well, Europe was always known as a Christian-based continent. You know, all the different countries with all their different languages were always held together, even during world wars, you know, by their common Christian faith and celebrations of all the Christian holidays. You know, even having ceasefires during wartime at Christmas and Easter. So yeah, with a long, rich history of Christianity, why would you bring in millions of people who are the exact antithesis of your own people's heritage? You know, I'll tell you why. It's because these woke, globalist, liberal pieces of shit hate God and Christianity as much as they hate white people. You know, it's like they're killing two birds with one stone. So these crazy EU leaders bring in the only people on the planet that probably hate white infidels and Christians more than they do, if and that's even possible. You know, those Muslims, at least the faithful ones, which most of them are, well, they want nothing to do with our way of life or our way of government. You know, they see us as evil, ignorant barbarians. You know, nothing more than infidels that either need to convert to Islam or die. It's as simple as that. So yeah, you invite them into your country and then they expect you to conform to their ways. And the EU leaders fall for that bullshit and give in to all of their demands. After all, they don't want to be labeled as an Islamophobe at any cost. The funny thing about all of this is that Trump could fix all of their problems in a heartbeat if they would only listen to him. More on that coming up. The tragedy of it all is that these jerks who run the EU are never going to admit to their probable existential mistake. You know, they're just too woke, too stubborn, too narcissistic, and just downright too stupid. And it's not like the Muslims we brought in to America are any different, but luckily for us, we didn't bring in enough of them to overrun us like Europe did. And look what happened in the few places where they did. You know, like Dearborn, Michigan, I think somewhere in Minnesota. I mean, just look at the elected politicians from these districts. You know, you got your mentally ill hand Omar and that horrible rash Tlaib lady, you know, both members of the squad and both widely known as America-hating traitors. And people are constantly calling for Omar's deportation. And there's a place in Texas where the Muslims were going to build their own town, you know, with their own laws, which would be Sharia law, of course. You know, that's what all the true Muslims want. You know, and Texas is trying to put a stop to it as we speak. You know, good luck, Governor Abbott. Now, about Trump helping the Europeans through this dilemma. You know, his nation-first policies have already changed the political landscape in a bunch of the EU countries who already voted in their own nation-first version of Trump. And that the EU leadership wasn't illegally interfering in their elections the same way as our own Democrat liberal leaders do over here, well, probably most of those countries could fix their own problems and allow themselves to become great again. So yeah, most of the citizens of those European countries just simply want their nations back. You know, they're sick of the Soros-backed globalist open border policies. They're sick of being called racist and whatever phobia they're labeled as. You know, they want their country's money back, and they want to go back to being proud of whatever nationality they happen to be, and a return back to their Christian roots, just like most of us Americans do. You know, the Europeans are at a real crossroads moments here in their history, and I can't imagine them doing the right thing. You know, that's why I say the Europeans are cooked. While the rest of the world is seeing how Trump and his policies can help all of them prosper like never before. Well, the EU leaders are all suffering from Trump derangement syndrome and will probably lose everything because of it. You know, exactly the same thing happening to our own Democratic Party here in America. I say good riddance to all of them. They'll get exactly what they deserve. And when you think about it, the only thing Europe has going for it anyways is tourism. And ironically enough, the biggest draw being all of the famous Christian churches and cathedrals scattered throughout most of their countries. You know, a lot of people are already too scared to go there now anyways. Okay, here's this week's stupid shit off the top of my head. You know, everyone asks me, what's up with the machete? Well, this swamp, which starts about 3 feet behind this net and goes on for miles, is full of every nasty animal we've got down here in Florida. You know, from giant 12-foot-plus gators to more cottonmouths and other poisonous snakes than you can shake a stick at. You know, all the way to wild boars, a couple different kinds of big cats, to even an occasional skunk ape, which is what we call Bigfoots down here.
Watch it. You're making stuff up again.
Yeah, okay. I made that last part up. But as of last night, I can add bears to the list. You know, this is from my front yard just last night. Check it out. There's a bear in my front yard. What the hell? Tell me that's not some pretty crazy shit. Well, that's about it. Hope you liked what I said. All comments are welcome, good and bad. You know I love them all. And please, if you haven't, subscribe and like. Until next time, see you at the swamp.